All right. All right. Well, welcome everybody. I'm Chris Burkett. I'm director of the Ashbrook Scholar Program for undergraduate students at Ashland University. Thanks for joining us today for our fifth spring webinar. We have two technical assistants on hand who can help you if you have issues with the WebEx platform. Please right-click on their names and select chat to communicate with them. Also, Dr. Rogers and I will be having a conversation about two important figures and two important texts, but encourage all of you joining us to join in that conversation by submitting questions in the Q&A section in WebEx, and we'll try to answer as many of those questions as possible. Today we're talking about, our topic is MLK, Malcolm X, and the future of race relations in America. And in order to think about this topic, everything we do here through Ashbrook begins with reading original texts and documents. So all of our conversations begin with a document or a text. So we're talking about Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail and Malcolm X's famous speech, The Ballot or the Bullet. And again, I mentioned I'm Chris Burkett. I'm happy to be joined today by Dr. Cara Rogers, who teaches history here at Ashland University. So thanks, Cara, for being here. Really appreciate it. So maybe we start by talking a little bit about the sort of context of these documents and these two important figures, especially in the 1960s, to help frame the significance of their arguments in the texts. And I think we all know this. Any of us who are familiar at all with these two great figures realize that they seem to have some very fundamentally opposed views on the relationship between the white race, the black race, and all races in a sense. And they have some different views on whether or not we want to strengthen those relations or further divide those relations between the races. One way to think about it, and I know this term isn't often used anymore, but do we want to somehow integrate the races, or is our differences in race less important than, say, the fact that we are one people in the sense that we're Americans? Or should we move in the other direction and emphasize differences in race and even start thinking about whether we are in fact one people as Americans? And I think we'll see those two arguments come out in these two texts from these two thinkers. But we know, Cara, and feel free to jump in, of course, at any time, that things are particularly nasty at this time in terms of race relations. Segregation is still in force in some places, especially in the southern states. But racism in general has, insofar as it is, manifests itself as a real hostility and oppression in certain ways toward the black race, is really bad in the 50s and 60s as more and more people push for racial equality, in particular legal equality. But the violence is growing, tensions are rising. And that's true, by the way, not just in the South, but in the North. One thing I find interesting is that Dr. King is very well known for organizing marches and boycotts and really having a strong voice in the southern states, not simply in the southern states, but that's where he's best known for his work. Whereas Malcolm X is really kind of a northern leader of the civil rights movement. He has got a strong presence in places like Chicago, New York, obviously, and Detroit and other northern cities. And I think, not to overlook the obvious, it's important to note that what this reveals is that racism, which both of them are trying to deal with, is not limited to the South. Interestingly enough, it may take different forms in the South and the North, but there are real problems with regard to race in both the South and in the North, and especially in the larger cities in the North. Racism takes on a particular form that is different in some ways than Southern racism, but in many ways just as oppressive and violent. So So I guess, Cara, maybe I'll just start with Malcolm X's argument, unless you have anything you want to throw in at this point, any general observations.
Yeah, I think I'll just maybe quickly add the fact that, for King and for Malcolm X, 1963 and 1964 are really interesting and pivotal years. And for the whole civil rights movement as a whole, they've seen several victories in the 1950s in the Supreme Court. We saw the court officially rule that schools cannot be segregated. We've seen the court rule that buses cannot be segregated. Black people can't be forced to sit in the back of the bus, and that a lot of that's due to the work of Martin Luther King and the Montgomery bus boycott after Rosa Parks refuses to sit at the back of the bus. But by the time we get to 1963, when Martin Luther King gives his letter from Birmingham jail, he's really needing another win. He's facing a lot of opposition. A lot of people are getting increasingly frustrated, as you mentioned, in the North and in the South. It's the civil rights movement is reaching kind of a critical mass of people getting frustrated with the slow pace of change and the increase in violence and increase in opposition from strict segregationists. So it's fascinating to look at these two speeches because they're coming at kind of a crucial moment where the country is at a crossroads in which direction it's going to go.
So those are really great points. And again, in the South, as you mentioned, on the one side, more and more people are becoming more and more insistent upon immediate action to end segregation. But on the other side, in the South, some people are really digging their heels in. And even though the courts have struck down certain forms of legal segregation, right, and in fact, all segregation in the following year, in essence, with the Civil Rights Act, will be struck down. There are still ways people are finding to engage in segregation and racial oppression, right? So, sort of in soft, I don't want to call it soft ways, is not the right term, right? But if you can't have legalized Jim Crow segregation in the South, what do? Well, you use the fact that people of importance and influence in police departments and elected office and mayor's offices and things like that are white in a lot of these southern towns, and they refuse to issue permits to march, for example, or protest, or they crack down on people for disturbing the peace when they're exercising civil disobedience in some very harsh ways, right? So it's not soft racism; it's hard in a certain way, but it's less legal in the sense that segregation as a whole had been legal for the better part of 60 years up to this point, but it's sort of institutionalized in less tangible ways in the South, and that's true. But sorry, go ahead, Cara. I'm sorry.
No, I'm absolutely agreeing, and I'm also thinking in particular of voting rights. That technically Black people have been allowed to vote since the 15th Amendment, but you're still seeing in both of these documents these civil rights leaders talking about the lack of access to the ballot. That Black people are struggling to get access. It's being denied in all sorts of mischievous ways that segregationists are finding to exclude people from properly participating in the democratic process. And the big question is, how do Black people now move forward from this place when they're still being denied access to so many things that the courts have said they should be able to access?
Yeah, again, great points. And on top of all of that, of course, the threat of violence, whether open or clandestine, right, is also a powerful a tool that people are using to keep people from going to to vote or doing other things in public and so on and so forth, right? And that's true both in the South and in the North, interestingly enough. In the North, the racism, and I think we'll see this come out in some of the arguments Malcolm X makes, especially. The racism manifests itself again in less tangible ways, but Malcolm X will also argue that racism in the North is becoming institutionalized, right? So we've heard the term, one of the popular terms today is the idea of systemic racism. It's sort of built into a system that was developed and has been largely operated, if you will, by white Americans. And in the North, what you see is racism manifesting itself in police violence, right? there are a number of shootings of black young men and things, and so on and so forth. Police violence, beatings, and there are even though there's not legal segregation again in the North, there's a kind of de facto segregation that goes on in many parts of these cities, right, where whites and blacks both have there's just sort of an understanding that this is the sort of restaurant where black people eat, and this is the sort of place where white people eat, or this is where black people buy their groceries, and so on and so forth, right? So it's not on the level of the legal, so to speak, where it's legally enforced, but it still exists, and it manifests itself in the North in very economic ways, I think, especially when you look at the demographics of northern cities, and you notice that the worst parts of these cities, the ghettos, right, the really run down and sort of ugly parts of town are largely populated by blacks, which are crowded into these extremely tight spaces, living in incredibly unsanitary apartment complexes and housing these sorts of things. And then you realize that it's hard, again, in these sort of intangible or softer ways. Discrimination in hiring is rampant in northern cities. There, and there are a whole host of ways in which this racism is manifesting itself. For example, as I mentioned, it's not legal, but there were, shopkeepers, grocery stores who would not sell to black people. Not legal that they did it based on race, but they would find other reasons not to sell, or they would claim there were other reasons why they didn't want these sort of people, as they would call them, buying from them. So there's economic discrimination. So I think those are the kinds of problems that Malcolm X is really picking up on, especially in his argument as to why he ultimately calls for a separate nation, essentially, of sorts. So Malcolm X is really famous for calling for moving away from the idea of integration of the races, and in fact strengthening the differences between them on both a social, economic, and political level, right? So just, again, most of us are familiar with Malcolm X's background. He actually comes from Omaha, Nebraska. Real name was Malcolm Little, which he rejected, and took the name X instead, on the grounds that Little was a name that was given to him and his family by white men, right? So this was a white man's name that was imposed on him and his ancestors, and so he changed his name from Little to X, and the X in many ways symbolizes the fact that he has no nation, right? He doesn't belong in a way in this particular civilization, American civilization, as it's rooted in Western civilization. So X means, he is Malcolm with no nation, of no nation. Again, I want to throw this out here kind of early on. We have to be careful about making these kinds of distinctions, but there are in some ways two phases to Malcolm X's life. In his last couple of years when he's alive, his teachings and his rhetoric and his speeches is a little bit different than throughout most of his public rhetoric through the late 1950s into the early 1960s, when he takes a very hard stance in calling for almost total racial separation, at least in a political sense, from the black and white races. A little bit later in life, he changed that up a little bit, so maybe we can talk about that later. But Malcolm X, again, coming from Omaha, Nebraska, he was first exposed to Nation of Islam teaching while he was in prison. He was convicted of breaking and entering and sentenced to 10 years, where he was first exposed to the Nation of Islam, and very quickly after prison, grew in the ranks of this organization and really became the leading spokesperson for the organization, which of course was led by Elijah Muhammad. And While Malcolm X was associated with that organization throughout most of the 50s and early 60s, he was very careful to be the mouthpiece, as he was known, of the nation, right? So he was very careful not to say anything in his own public speeches or addresses or writings that was contrary to the teaching of Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam in an official sense. So a lot of the rhetoric that we find him using, including in this ballot and bullet speech, which comes at the end of his time, toward the end of his time with the Nation of Islam, is very, very blunt and very harsh in many ways, right? So Malcolm X, in his speeches on behalf of Nation of Islam, was really emphasized four key components or four key beliefs with regard to the races. The first of which was that the black race is in fact superior to the white race. Part of the reason for that superiority is the second point of emphasis, which is the argument that the black race was the official or the original race of the earth, in an inversion of sort of the what had come to be thought of as sort of the typical Western way of thinking about things, right? Which was the white race was the dominant race and the black race was sort of a sub race of some sort, right? Or a splinter race. There was actually a long period of time in which people believed this to be true, based on the sciences of social sciences of the 19th century. But Malcolm X emphasized that historically the black race was the original race of the earth. Three white people were devils. You find this rhetoric a lot in his speeches in the prior to, say, the last 2 years of his life, when he softened on that language quite a bit. So that's a third point that he emphasized a lot in his rhetoric, and I would say the fourth point is, again, this notion that that white men, because they're devils, can't be trusted, and therefore what's really needed is some sort of unity of Black Americans, blacks, I should say, in America, into some kind of social unit, a nation of sorts, right? Its own political entity. So, and you see this language reflected a lot in the speech, the ballot or the bullet, which I'm trying to pull up here. I'm working on two screens here. Sorry about that. If you happen to have a copy of the speech in front of you, right at the beginning, he begins by talking about, excuse me, he says, although I'm still a Muslim, I'm not here tonight to discuss my religion. So this is not a religious speech. He says, I'm not here to argue or discuss anything that we differ about, because it's time for us to submerge our differences and realize that it is best for us, and by us, again, he means, you know, blacks to whom he is speaking directly in this speech. It's best for us to first see that we have the same problem, a common problem, a problem that will make you catch hell, whether you're a Baptist or a Methodist or a Muslim or a nationalist. We're all in the same boat, and we are all going to catch the same hell from the same man. And he just happens to be a white man. All of us have suffered here in this country political oppression at the hands of the white man, economic exploitation at the hands of the white man, and social degradation at the hands of the white man. So right there are three ways in which this racism has manifested itself most prominently for Malcolm X, right? Political oppression, economic exploitation, and social degradation, and all at the hands of the white man. And he immediately goes into right after this, in the next paragraph, he says, now, in speaking like this, it doesn't mean that we're anti-white, but it does mean that we're anti-exploitation, we're anti-degradation, we're anti-oppression. And if the white man doesn't want us to be anti-him, let him stop oppressing and exploiting and degrading us. Right? So he lays out the problem initially at the beginning of the text, and then he goes into what he considers to be the solutions. And the solution is, as he says famously, if we don't do something real soon, I think you'll have to agree that we're going to be forced either to use the ballot or the bullet. It's one or the other in 1964. It isn't that time is running out. Time has run out. So the ballot or the bullet is the theme of this speech. Um, and Malcolm X is sometimes misunderstood, I think, by using this term to be advocating violence. If you read the rest of this speech carefully, what you find is that he is not advocating violence against whites, but what he is emphasizing is the right of blacks to defend themselves with force and violence if they find themselves threatened with that same kind of force from whites. So he is not calling for a violent takeover. He's not calling for blacks to initiate violence against whites. But as he says famously in this speech, let me see if I can find a good paragraph here, and then I'll stop and maybe we can turn to Dr. King here in just a minute. Let's see. Trying to find the famous paragraph where he lays this out. I know it's toward the end of the speech. Bear with me for just a second, if you will. Okay, how about this? He says, there's a new thinking coming in. There's a new strategy coming in. It'll be Molotov cocktails this month and hand grenades next month and something else next month. It'll be ballot or it'll be bullets. It'll be liberty or it will be death. And here he's referring to the escalating violence on both sides in a way, right? But especially by whites who are trying to suppress racial equality by increasing or escalating uses of force, right? So it'll be this is going to continue to escalate, and he says, therefore, it'll be ballots or it'll be bullets. It'll be liberty or it will be death. The only difference about this kind of death is it'll be reciprocal. You know what is meant by reciprocal? I don't usually deal with those big words because I don't usually deal with big people. I deal with small people. But what he means by this, he goes on, he says, it takes two to tango. When I go, you go. So what he means by this is, and there's another famous paragraph here, I'm still looking for it, where he essentially says, I'm not calling for violence outright, but if a black man is being oppressed or beaten by white men, then it's time for the black men to stand up and give it back, essentially, right? So it's not finding it is a long speech. So I'm scanning through the speech looking for this. So that's one important point or aspect of the speech, is the idea of defending the right to self-defense on the part of Black Americans. I would say two other large points. One has to do with the politics of America. This, of course, is 1964, which is an important election year for many reasons, right? Vietnam is escalating, so there are foreign policy considerations. This is a year when there's a real contest politically between two competing sort of political ideologies or philosophies in the candidacies of Lyndon Johnson with the Great Society and Barry Goldwater, who was anti-Great Society. And on this point, Malcolm X says it doesn't matter who wins the elections. One thing we've learned over the years from politics is it doesn't matter whether Republicans hold power or Democrats hold power. The result is always the same: social degradation, economic oppression, political oppression. It doesn't matter. So he is bought out. He is fed up with our political system and not going to try to operate or bring about reforms within the framework of our political system. And then the third broad point I'll mention, and then I'll stop, is that as a result of the two things he was just mentioning, interestingly enough, he does not see himself as an American. I had a paragraph marked earlier, if I can find it again, where he says, I don't buy into the American dream at all, right? Let me see if I can find this. Oh boy, I had it marked and now I can't find it. At any rate, one of his central arguments is that, oh, I found it. No, I'm not an American. I'm one of the 22 million Black people who are the victims of Americanism. One of the 22 million Black people who are the victims of democracy. Nothing but disguised hypocrisy. So I'm not standing here speaking to you as an American or a patriot or a flag saluter or a flag waver. No, not I. I'm speaking as a victim of this American system, and I see America through the eyes of the victim. I don't see any American dream. I see an American nightmare. So this is a very direct statement of Malcolm X's rejection of the idea that he is an American. So those are three central aspects of the speech, and we can maybe elaborate on these later. I think I see some questions coming in, which we can turn to in just a little bit. But Dr. Rogers, obviously, Dr. King takes a very different take on some of these issues and questions. Not that he disagrees with the racism and the oppression, but perhaps different views on whether we should think of ourselves as American.
Yeah, absolutely.
Different means for dealing with it. But
Yeah. I love looking at these documents side by side because they're really two sides of a coin, and they have, in some ways, they're confronting the same problems. They have similar experiences as Black men in America, but they have very different thoughts on how to solve these problems moving forward. So, looking at Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail, just a quick little bit of background for us all. So, we mentioned that King is um, kind of needing a win. He's needing some victories in the civil rights movement. At the time that he gets to Birmingham in 1963, he's coming off of a failed civil rights movement protesting time in Georgia, in Albany, Georgia. He had gone there on the invitation of people in Albany to try to help out with desegregation, and their movement had failed to achieve their goals. So he came to Birmingham, Alabama, on the invitation of the local leaders of the civil rights movement there. And Birmingham it's kind of the worst of the worst. He tells us in this speech, or in this letter rather, that Birmingham is perhaps the most segregated place in America. And it's kind of ruled over. The commissioner of public safety, ironically enough, is a guy named Bull Connor, who's a real staunch segregationist who is not afraid to use violence, dogs, clubs. He's not afraid to turn the full power of like a fire hydrant, a fire hose onto little children who are protesting. He's not afraid to use force to keep his town segregated. And in a way, this is bad for the citizens of the town of Birmingham, but it's also a crucial moment and a good thing for the civil rights movement as a whole, because this means that Martin Luther King and the other members of his Southern Christian Leadership Conference come to Birmingham, and because of the way that they're treated in this town, they attract a lot of outside attention, and the eyes of the country start to focus on what's happening in Birmingham, and to see in vivid black and white detail the violence and the kind of the hatred that can be directed toward nonviolent protesters in Birmingham. And Martin Luther King and the people with him are peacefully marching, they are doing peaceful sit-ins, but there's an injunction that the town issues against them. And the town says to Martin Luther King, you are not allowed to march, you are not allowed to publicly block, downtown streets with all of your thousands of protesters. Even in peaceful nonviolent demonstrations, we want you to have to go to court and argue your right to do this marching. And King breaks the law. And because of this, he goes to jail. And while he's in Birmingham jail, he decides that he's going to respond to some criticism that's come against him. He tells us in a footnote to the very first paragraph of Birmingham jail, he tells us he's responding to a statement that was published in the local paper by 8 local clergymen. A rabbi, a priest, and 6 Protestant clergymen had publicly called out Martin Luther King, not because they were strong segregationists. They were moderate white people. But they disagree with his methods and they disagree with what he's doing. They think that he's hurting the cause of civil rights and they want him to stop and to change his methods. And King decides while he's, sitting in his jail cell in Birmingham that he's going to write a public response. So he writes the letter from Birmingham jail and directs it to his fellow clergymen, but he's actually also hoping that this will be published in an outlet like the New York Times. He knows it'll have a wider audience, and this is his chance to really explain himself and his nonviolent philosophy. And when I read this, to me, it seems as though he kind of divides up his letter into two, at least, sections. You could argue there are even more, but two broad sections. The first half, Martin Luther King is responding to point by point criticisms that these clergymen have levied against him and his civil rights movement. And he goes through and he responds to their criticisms. And then about halfway through, his tone shifts a bit and he starts sharing his disappointment and his heartache. Number one, at the way that the white moderate community has treated him and the civil rights movement. And number two, he talks about his disappointment with the church, the white church, that are supposed to be his brothers in Christ, but he feels like are not acting that way. So let me just talk about a couple of the key passages that I think are really memorable and important, starting with this first half where he's responding to the criticisms that have been directed against him. And I'm reading to you out of I have a handy dandy book that Martin Luther King wrote. So instead of having to scroll through the document, I'm reading from this book toward you. One of the first things that he tells us is he's been accused of showing up as an outsider and causing trouble. And the 8 clergymen say to him, Dr. King, why don't you negotiate? Number one, why are you here? And number two, why are you causing trouble? Why don't you negotiate with the business leaders of our community rather than marching and protesting and boycotting? And he responds to them by saying, there are 4 basic steps in any nonviolent campaign. Step number 1, you have to collect facts and find out whether an injustice has occurred. And he's done that. He's discovered that Birmingham, Alabama is the most segregated town in America, and it's very clear that there are injustices occurring. There are bombings, there are lynchings, there's violence toward Black people, there's attempts to stop them from being able to register to vote. This is all clear and documented. So there's injustice, number 1. Number 2, negotiate. He's tried that. And the leading citizens of the town and the African-American community tried to negotiate with the leaders of the business community in Birmingham, and the negotiations have failed. The white people in town are not willing to desegregate the stores, for example. Number 3, Martin Luther King says, anytime that you want to protest injustice, after you've investigated, after you've negotiated, purify yourself. And King is very clear in talking about how he and the people who are with him are dedicated to being solid citizens, upright Christians, having respectful, loving attitudes. He believes that they've purified their hearts and their motives, and now they're acting. And he says also, by the way, I didn't just show up here, I was invited. I'm part of this larger network of protesters, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and people who are members of that conference in town asked me to come. So he defends himself. He says, I'm not an outsider. I was asked to come. We've carefully considered what we're doing here. We don't mean to cause trouble, but we do feel like we have to take some direct action and not just negotiate anymore. He says, yes, this is going to create tension, but sometimes tension is necessary for change. He uses this fantastic example of the gadfly. He compares himself to almost like a mosquito. Yes, it's irritating. Yes, it creates some discomfort, but you need sometimes to have something uncomfortable and irritating in order to prompt change. And Birmingham, Alabama is never going to change unless somebody comes and tries to provoke discomfort and provoke action and change on behalf of the white community. He tells us freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. Okay, so he's demanding change. And then toward the, a little bit before halfway in his letter, Martin Luther King changes tone a little bit, and he gives us what I think is one of the most powerful paragraphs in American history. Don't think I'm exaggerating. Maybe I am. Y'all can tell me what you think. writing to several white clergymen, and he's trying to explain to them why the Black community can't wait and can't negotiate and can't be silent anymore. And he writes, I think, one of the longest paragraphs ever written. And it's a bunch of phrases all joined together by semicolons. I don't recommend doing this in your own papers, but it works for Dr. King. It's a great rhetorical device. He says, perhaps it's easy for those of you who have never felt the stinging darts of segregation to say, wait. And then he goes into this long list of things that have happened to him and his family and the people that he loves. But when you have seen vicious mobs lynch your mothers and fathers at will and drown your sisters and brothers at whim, when you have seen hate-filled policemen curse, kick, and even kill your Black brothers and sisters, when you see the vast majority of your 20 million Negro brothers smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in the midst of an affluent society, when you suddenly find your tongue twisted and your speech stammering as you seek to explain to your 6-year-old daughter why she can't go to the public amusement park that has just been advertised on television, and see tears welling up in her eyes when she's told that Funtown is closed to colored children, and see ominous clouds of inferiority beginning to form in her little mental sky, and see her beginning to distort her personality by developing an unconscious bitterness toward white people, when you have to concoct an answer for a 5-year-old son who is asking, Daddy, why do white people treat colored people so mean? And on it goes, this personal, deeply intimate list of the ways in which segregation is damaging not only Black men and women and Black little boys and girls, but it's also hurting the white community. And he gives us this incredibly vivid picture of him telling his little girl, I'm sorry, sweetie, I can't take you to Disneyland because you're Black. And that's the only reason. And he says, not only does that make her feel inferior, but it begins to distort her personality. It causes her to become bitter toward the white community. He's not just trying to end segregation for the sake of Black people. He's trying to end segregation for the sake of the whole community and the love that we are all supposed to have for one another in a Christian society. And by the end of this long paragraph, you have to wonder what those 8 clergymen were thinking if they didn't have more of a sympathy for him, now that they've maybe put themselves in his shoes a little bit more and realized why it's so hard for the Black community to keep being told, wait, change will come eventually. Now, a couple more big important moments I think we should talk about in this letter that King gives. One is pretty soon after his long paragraph, he turns to the objection that these white ministers have raised about how he's willing to break the law. And this is a good point that these white ministers have raised. They're saying to him, excuse us, Dr. King, you say that you're a Christian, you're supposed to obey the law, and you say that you want people to obey the Supreme Court's ruling of 1954 when they said that school segregation is illegal. What gives you, Dr. King, the right to decide that you're going to disobey the law? You broke the law, that's why you're in jail. He was supposed to not march and not protest, and he's broken the law, and that's why he's being punished. How can he advocate law breaking? Isn't that going to create a worse society? And King has to defend himself and his protesters against this charge of law breaking. And maybe Dr. Birkett and I can talk about this a little bit more later on of the reasons that King gives why it's okay to break a law. And he tells us the reason why is because there are just laws and there are unjust laws. I think the most powerful example that he gives is Hitler made laws. You could choose to obey the laws that Hitler made in Germany, but you would be breaking a higher law. You'd be breaking moral law. You'd be breaking natural law if you agreed to go along with murdering 6 million Jews. And Martin Luther King gives that example to kind of prove that, yes, he's not advocating that we should all just go around and break whatever law we don't like, but he is trying to draw a distinction between unjust man-made laws and just moral laws that follow the higher law, the law of the Christian God, the law of the Declaration of Independence. He mentions natural law. So maybe we can come back to that. But King defends himself against this accusation of law breaking, and then he turns the tables a little bit, and he starts talking to his white accusers, and he says to them, I'm very disappointed by the way that white moderates have been reacting toward the nonviolent movement. White moderates, he tells us about halfway through this speech, are maybe a worse problem than the Ku Klux Klan, because they are insisting that African Americans suffer silently and with a good attitude, and they are insisting that the African Americans suffer under a negative peace, he calls it, which is the absence of tension, rather than striving for a positive peace, which is the presence of justice. They say, we agree with you that segregation is bad, but we think that you need to stop making a fuss and breaking the law. You need to be calm, you need to be quiet, you need to wait for the laws to change things. And when King says, that's not good enough, that's not working quickly enough, the white moderates are stopping him from being able to achieve change. And then he says, even maybe more disappointing than the way that white moderates have been acting toward his nonviolent movement is the way that the church has been acting toward the nonviolent movement. That he is a Christian, that he's attempting to bring the love of Jesus and the gospel of justice to these different parts of the South. And instead of being encouraged and supported, the white South, the white Christian South in particular, has continued to remain segregated, has very seldom joined hands and joined arms to support this movement. They've been more sympathetic, he says, to the oppressors than to the oppressed. And Martin Luther King feels like this goes against the entire point of the gospel of Christianity. All right, last point. The final way that Dr. King ends this letter is by comparing himself to Malcolm X. He doesn't mention Malcolm by name, but he mentions Elijah Muhammad, the head of the Nation of Islam. And Dr. King tells the white moderate, the clergymen that are criticizing him, you know what, you really have a choice here. Either our country can go the direction of the movement that I'm trying to lead, this nonviolent protest movement, or if you don't encourage African Americans to join with me, this pent-up frustration is going to come out perhaps through bitterness, anger, hatred, violence, and Black nationalism. He says, if nonviolent protest had not given people a way to express their anger and their frustration and advocate for change, the streets of the South would be flowing with blood. And perhaps Dr. King is warning us that if change does not occur, if white moderates do not help change to happen, then the Black nationalist and maybe even more radical violent philosophies are going to gain traction, and the country is going to experience a race war. And these moderates really need to choose a side here. They cannot keep encouraging silence and patience, that this is not going to last. And finally, he ends on a hopeful note. He doesn't end on the bloody note, he ends on the hopeful note. He says, the reason why he has faith and the reason why he has hope for the church and hope for America, toward the very end of his letter, he says, we will reach the goal of freedom in Birmingham and all over the nation because the goal of America is freedom. Malcolm X doesn't feel like an American. He feels so betrayed by what's happened to African Americans that he's not even an American anymore. But Martin Luther King takes the completely opposite approach. He embraces his American identity because, according to Martin Luther King, abused and scorned though we may be, our destiny, Black Americans' destiny, is tied up with America's destiny. Before the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth, we were here. Before the pen of Jefferson etched the majestic words of the Declaration of Independence across the pages of history, we were here. We will win our freedom because the sacred heritage of our nation and the eternal will of God are embodied in our echoing demands. All right, I will stop talking and maybe we
can. Thank you. That was a great summary. And can I just say a couple of points that you raised, I think are really important, and especially your last point about Dr. King's invocation of the America as a kind of idea or a set of ideas or principles. He doesn't reject those and embraces them. He reminds me a lot of, say, Frederick Douglass, or if anybody's familiar with the author Ralph Ellison, who wrote one of my favorite novels of all time, Invisible Man. Dr. King seems to be able to make a distinction between the way America is, with its racism and oppression and violence and segregation, as opposed to what America was meant to be or stands for in a kind of principled way, right? I'm not sure if I'm putting this very clearly, but Dr. King seems to be invoking the idea that we can't confuse the problems of America, the way they actually are, with the idea of what America stands for: liberty, equality. The principles upon which America is founded are worth embracing. And we've deviated or never really lived up to those principles, but that's not grounds for rejecting them. So in a way, as you're pointing out, Dr. Rogers, Dr. King wants to press forward and justify what he's doing, at least in part, on the idea that he is trying to bring about these reforms so that America can sort of live up to its original promise, or the idea of what it was meant to be, as opposed to what it actually is. Malcolm X can't make, or doesn't make, that distinction. It's all systemic. It's the oppression has been built in from the beginning. The principles are empty rhetoric, and he'll use that kind of language. But interestingly enough, when I look at the kinds of things Malcolm X is calling for, he actually sounds very American in what he's calling for. He's emphasizing the importance of liberty, the importance of freedom, the importance of equality, the importance of equal opportunity, and the right to defend oneself, right? The right of self-defense. In a way, he sounds like an American patriot, in the years leading up to the Revolutionary War, right? In 1774, 1775. He is, without calling them American ideas, Malcolm X is defending ideas or principles that sound very American in their essence. And on this point, then, by the way, this reminds me again of the key passage you pointed out, Dr. Rogers, or one of the key passages where Dr. King is making the distinction between just and unjust laws. I mean, what a fantastic just line of thought from Dr. King on this, right? He says, how does one determine whether a law is just or unjust? A just law is a man-made law or man-made code that squares with the moral law or the law of God, right? An unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in eternal law and natural law. So there's this sense of a higher law for Dr. King. And again, I would say the same in a more subtle way is true for Malcolm X. What Malcolm X really is calling for is something higher in terms of what he actually calls later, after the speech, the ballot and bullet speech, human rights, human principles that are inherent in all human beings, interestingly enough. So even Malcolm X in later speeches will start to invoke this idea of a higher law that has to be met by all man-made laws or political laws.
I wonder if I could jump in and ask a question
Please.
here. So my understanding of Malcolm X is that while he was a member of the Nation of Islam, his theology or his understanding of God and law would have been an interpretation of Islam, not traditional Islam, but a very specific form of Black nationalist Islam that was created in Detroit in the 1930s. And that this version of Islam would perhaps emphasize a form of justice that's more closely related to revenge and the separation of races because of a racial hierarchy, that the Black race is superior to the white race. But by the end of 1963 and going into 64, 65, X veered away from the Nation of Islam, had a disagreement with Elijah Muhammad, and converted to Sunni Islam. And is it right, would it be fair to say that he started to argue that perhaps there is more of a unity between the races and a brotherhood of the races than he had originally said?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and I don't want to overdo this, but Malcolm X made his trip to Mecca I think in '64. And while he was there, what he found was um, that there were a number of non-Black human beings who supported his cause and were very outspoken about the problems of race in the world, and including in the United States. And he came to be very good friends with with uh, Europeans, white Americans who happen to also be Muslim, who were there, and that seems to have had an effect on him. And that language of the white man being the devil pretty much disappears from his rhetoric after his trip to Mecca. And when he returns, he is much more open to cooperation between the races in terms of finding solutions to the problems of racism than he had been in this really famous speech of his, The Ballad or the Bullet. So yeah, there seems to have been a little bit of a change of heart on Malcolm X's part. Not in terms of he never softened on the problems and the need to deal with the problems, but he seemed to be much more. He found in Islam, his version, as you say, he converted to Sunni Islam. He found in Islam a way to transcend race in a certain kind of way. That the struggle was not simply whites versus black; it was a racial struggle, but it was the problems affected people of all races in various ways. So yeah, he found a way to transcend that. Interestingly enough, so that's a really good point that you raised. Can I just raise a question too, from something you were pointing out earlier, and it goes back to this point about disobedience to the law, because Dr. King says in the Birmingham jail letter, he says, "I hope you are seeing the distinction I'm trying to point out. In no sense do I advocate evading or defying the law, as would the rabid segregationist, right? That would lead to anarchy. Here's the key sentence I was thinking of. One who breaks an unjust law must do so openly, lovingly, and with a willingness to accept the penalty." I wonder if you think Dr. King would say that's the problem with Malcolm X, in part because Malcolm X, of course, is advocating in some ways breaking of the law. He has his version of civil disobedience, but I wonder if you think what Dr. King would think of X in terms of his civil disobedience. Is the problem that he's not doing so lovingly and with a willingness to accept the penalty?
That's a fantastic question. And I think that goes back to the religious beliefs that for Dr. King, justice is reconciliation, not victory. And there's a fantastic quote that Dr. King gives in another address where he says that the goal of what he was attempting to accomplish in Birmingham was not victory, but it was justice and reconciliation. And that key there for me is the reconciliation part, that King was willing to break the law in order to accomplish the achieving of justice, of making sure that there's equality for the races. But where I think Malcolm would be willing to fight back and not be worried about how to get along together after we fight, because we're going to all be separate. King's vision is that we are all brothers, that we are all meant to live in unity, and that we're taught by Christ to love, to forgive, and even to reconcile. The example I like to give my students is that when my sister and I get in a really big fight, if we reconcile, we both apologize, we forgive one another, and we go to the movies together. We've reconciled and we're forming a new relationship. And that was always King's goal. But for X, the reconciliation is not necessary. All that is necessary is justice. And so breaking the law and dealing with the consequences for him is not so much about achieving reconciliation in the end. It's about we need to achieve justice, and then we need to achieve separation so that we can live as a powerful, strong, independent people.
Great. That's a great point. We've got a few minutes left. Should we take a couple of questions? I see some questions, I think.
Sure.
From a few people. So Matt asks, if Malcolm X doesn't care for politics or using political means, then why does he say ballot or bullet? That's a fantastic question. So when Malcolm X gave this speech, he was immediately accused of saying the ballot is no longer an option. We must resort to the bullet. And that's and Malcolm X said, that's not what I meant. You misunderstood my speech. What he's saying is, by ballot, he means trying to change things through politics within the framework of politics as it exists now, right? I mean, Democratic candidates, Republican candidates, doesn't matter. They all do the same thing, essentially, in the end, with regard to race, or have the same bad effects. They just take different forms. But he said he was not saying the ballot is not an option, but what he was calling for was a kind of Black unity, Blacks voting in blocks for Black representatives, and maybe possibly even the formation of political parties that explicitly exist to represent the interests of the Black community. So what he said he was calling for here, suggested he was calling for here, was a radical rethinking, or some way to either find new ways of engaging in politics within the existing framework, but more likely, he was emphasizing the need for an entirely separate sort of political process for Blacks themselves as we transitioned into the idea of a Black nation that in many ways would be self-governing. Again, this is tied deeply to his idea that there should be a Black nation. What did he mean by that? It's a little vague on sometimes on what this Black nation would look like. Are we talking about, carving out a part of territory within the United States that would be a Black nation? In some speeches, Malcolm X alluded to the idea of Indian reserves, reservations, and things like that as a possibility. But more often, what he emphasized was a Black nation within the nation that would, consist of, Blacks in Chicago, New York, LA, Detroit, various cities with heavy Black populations, forming a nation of their own in a certain way with their own, with leaders coming together to form economic policies that benefited Blacks. Blacks should engage in trade and commerce with other Black business owners. Creating from the ground up, in a way, a new system of representation for Blacks, which would include a role for voting, right? So, the ballot is still an option for Malcolm X. He always said, but not not simply voting for a Democrat or a Republican. If the ballot's going to matter, it's going to have to be something else. The voting is going to have to look something very different than what we have in terms of our options in 1964. So, what else do we have in terms of questions here?
Casey asked the question that Malcolm X and MLK ever directly address each other.
Yes. Go ahead. Sorry. Yeah. No, I didn't know. I didn't mean to cut you.
I know that there was one photograph ever taken of the two of them together, and it was an accident encounter that they had. They were both in Washington, D.C. at the same moment to one another. Do you know, did they ever actually write to one another? Or
That's about the extent of it. They really kept their distance. They referred to each other indirectly in various speeches, usually not by name, and they usually kept their distance. But there was that one moment, as you say, there's that famous photograph where they're together. And Dr. King doesn't look very happy in the photograph, if I recall correctly. But
he did work with people from the Nation of Islam. He did sit down with Elijah Muhammad, but not so much with Malcolm X.
Yeah, and especially somebody asked about the Black Panther organization. Devin asked about Malcolm X's impact on them. Of course, they really formed officially after Malcolm X's assassination. They were formed by former friends and colleagues of Malcolm X, but I think they were largely drawing inspiration from, let's say, the 1964 and earlier Malcolm X, with his emphasis on pretty strict separation. There's some question as to whether the Malcolm X of 65 and 66, before he was murdered, would have agreed with such an organization. But the reason I mention this is Dr. King, after Malcolm X's assassination, Dr. King has seen a lot of successes in the 60s, right, through the impact of his marches. The Civil Rights Act, of course, is passed. The Voting Rights Act is passed. And so there are some real successes there. But in the aftermath of all that, the question in 1966, 67 is, what do we do moving forward? And Dr. King actually finds himself out of necessity, right, for the sake of unifying the future of the civil rights movement, does work with members of the Black Panther, members of the Nation of Islam, and others for the sake of trying to unify them and keep the various groups representing civil rights from splintering even further, and therefore possibly undermining all the great work that they had accomplished up to this point. Dr. King is good at, he understands politics, and he understood that you cannot ignore the power of that voice coming from Nation of Islam and the Black Panthers and other such groups. You can't simply ignore them. So in the last few years of his life, he undertook to work with them to the extent that he could, and keep them on board, so that we wouldn't end up with all these sort of splinter groups working against each other moving forward. Here's a good question. There are a couple of lots of good questions coming in. Who would you argue had more of an impact on the, why is my text not working? Who would you argue had more of an impact on the civil rights movement?
I think if you were to ask the average person in the streets who they most associate with the civil rights movement, most people are going to say Martin Luther King. But I've heard a lot of convincing arguments that you really needed to have both, that both of those voices were important, powerful, directing the flow of anger and the flow of frustration and the flow of hope. But they were expressing all of the different sentiments that African Americans were experiencing during that time period. As far as having more of an impact on the civil rights movement, probably also, I would argue maybe King had more of an impact, because King is the figure that white people were able to work with, that he tried very hard to reach out across the aisle. And as we said, he emphasized reconciliation. Whereas Malcolm X might have been seen as a more threatening figure. He was definitely, both of them were watched and surveilled by the government. But Malcolm X in particular was on the much more radical end, whereas King presented a hope for the future that was something that was able to be embraced by all nationalities, all races. And in the end, I think we're living more in his vision of America than we are in Malcolm X's vision. I don't know if you want to add anything there, Dr. Burkett.
Oh, that was really well put. I mean, I guess the only thing I'll say is I completely agree with what you just said, except to point out that there still are disagreements along some of the lines of difference between King, right? So, and one of them is, to what extent is America good? And to what extent should we be proud of the fact, if as a Black person, to what extent should I and can I be proud of the fact that I'm an American? Am I an American, right? And I think we still do see some disagreement, a lot of disagreement on that point. And so in that sense, I see that lingering disagreement between Dr. King and Malcolm X on that point among contemporary today writers and thinkers and figures that represent the continuing civil rights movement. So that was a great question. We've got quite a few more. Maybe we'll take one more because we started a little bit late. So I think we addressed some of these. Oh, Dr. Rogers, how did moderates respond to MLK's letter then and years following? Do you know?
This is such a good question. To the best of my knowledge, there was some offense among the moderates that King addressed his letter to, that maybe, especially the fact that he had it published in the New York he was aiming to have it published in the New York Times, made them maybe respond with a little bit of offense, even though he tried to take a nice tone toward them. But over time, I think you see a lot more reconciliation within the larger Christian community in the South. So not a very specific answer. Sorry, Matt. I'm not. I can give you more information than that. I don't know if you have any more insight into this.
Oh, that sounds about right. Yeah. And again, see, this look, this is, so you've got these two great figures who are at the forefront of leading the civil rights effort, and they both die within a year of each other, right, or 2 years of each other. Malcolm X, they're both assassinated, and then moving forward, the question is, well, where do we go? What's the goal? And how do we go about achieving it? And the white moderate sort of voice, or the moderate voice, if you will, I think in some ways begins to be drowned out by some of the more radical call. Again, not to say that Dr. King's vision doesn't prevail in many important ways, as you were saying earlier. But one point I was trying to make earlier is when Malcolm X is assassinated and you have the rise of the Black Panthers, and you have a continued increase in sort of Black militancy, when I said Dr. King was working with them more and more out of necessity, again, because you can't ignore their arguments. I mean, it's a powerful argument that they were making. One change that you see in Dr. King in the last 2 or 3 years before his assassination is a greater and greater emphasis on the need to push for economic equality in a certain sense, right? So this language of achieving greater instituting or creating policies, largely through, or at least in part through government policies, right? Greater and greater economic opportunity for Black Americans, to put them on parity with white Americans. That becomes a point of emphasis for Dr. King in his last few years of life. And not to say that he didn't wholly believe in that, but I think in part he was adopting that language, or emphasizing that language, because that's the emphasis that Malcolm X is really, focusing on in his rhetoric when he's alive, right? And the followers of Malcolm X continue to emphasize that the real, I mean, there's the problem of brutality, the unequal incarceration, and all of these sorts of things that represent a kind of systemic racism, but the economic disparities and the economic problems are really front and center in Malcolm X's rhetoric, and you see Dr. King start to pick up some of that emphasis in his later rhetoric in the years leading up to his assassination. So, all right, well, thanks Dr. Rogers very much for being with us. This is very, very thoughtful, great contributions. I learned a lot from your thoughts and from your analysis of the text, and thanks everybody for submitting some great questions. Really appreciate it. So,
it's been a pleasure. Thank you, everybody. Well, you did some great questions for us.
Yeah, it was quite fun. So this webinar is going to be archived on teachingamericanhistory.org, our YouTube channel, within the next few days. If you want to rewatch it, share it with others. The other webinars in this series are already posted on YouTube. If you like thinking about interesting ideas and historical persons, take a look at our Ashbrook Academies, in which we both teach. Dr. Rogers teaches in the Ashbrook Academies in the summers, which are week-long programs. Normally we hold those on campus, but in light of the situation, these will be done online this summer. But they include discussions in those academies. Every participant has a microphone and a camera, and it's much more than two or scholars just leading lectures. But the conversation is open to everybody who's part of the academy. So if you're interested in that, take a look at the academies online. Just go to ashbrookacademy.org for more information. Our next webinar will be a week from today, next Thursday, April 30th. And the topic will be The Great Society, Leading America to New Heights, or the Beginning of the End for Liberty. So maybe be following up on some of the themes from today. in a certain sense. I'll be back for that discussion, and we'll also be joined by Dr. Jason Stevens. I think I'm also supposed to mention to you, Ben Kunkel normally would be here doing this, but he's off taking care of some important business, that we're going to expand and add a few more webinars, maybe 4 more webinars beyond our original 6 planned webinars for Thursdays. So we'll post those topics and dates pretty soon. So, all right, hope you can come back and join us for more conversations in the future. Thanks, and take care in the meantime. Thanks again, Cara. That was great.
Absolutely, my pleasure. It was a lot of fun.